YouTube's new election fraud policy tells us what we can and cannot say. Is big tech going too far? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. You know, when we started this show back in 2017, we called it America Uncensored. Hi, welcome to America Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. But then, after a few episodes, we changed it to America Uncovered, because we thought that name was closer to what we wanted to do with the show. That is, dig through the partisan media on both sides to uncover what's happening in America today, with all of its complications. Plus, there was this. Viewers from my incredibly popular TV show, China Uncensored, say to me, Chris, you should do America Uncensored. And I tell them, you know the media is not censored here, right? Oh, young, clean-shaven me. How naive he was. Because now, in 2020, old, bearded me is thinking, maybe I should change the name back to America Uncensored, because it's looking more and more like I was wrong about not being censored in America. Earlier this week, YouTube announced that they will start removing any piece of content uploaded today or anytime after that misleads people by alleging that widespread fraud or errors changed the outcome of the 2020 US presidential election. Although YouTube also claims that, as always, news coverage and commentary on these issues can remain on our site if there's sufficient education, documentary, scientific, or artistic context. Yeah, I've heard that one before. I'm sure their censorship bots will make the nuanced distinction between making claims and reporting on those claims. YouTube then goes on to boast that it's connecting people to authoritative information. There are some problems with that authoritative information, which I'll go into a little later in this episode. Now, depending on your political views, YouTube is either censoring content, or YouTube is just removing misleading fraud claims it should have removed sooner. I mean, it took them more than a month. Two totally different ways of framing the exact same story. Looks like America needs to be both uncensored and uncovered. But practically speaking, as with many of YouTube's content guidelines, this announcement is a little unclear. What if you're not alleging widespread election fraud, but you are alleging some fraud? What if you're interviewing someone else who alleges widespread election fraud? What if you're not alleging anything, but just talking about the topic of election fraud? Will your video get taken down for any of those things? YouTube did clarify to Tim Pool that you can still say Trump actually won the election, or even that it was stolen from Trump. But your video will be removed if you say that there was widespread fraud or error and that caused Trump to lose. Okay, this is starting to feel like one of those logic puzzles they give you in school. If Trump won the election and the election was stolen from him, was there widespread fraud or error? The answer is, the surgeon was the boy's mother. Sorry, wrong logic puzzle. The answer is no, because we don't want this video to get taken down. Nailed it! YouTube's announcement is just the latest example of how social media companies have tobogganed down the slippery slope from claiming to be neutral platforms to behaving like publishers giving editorial guidelines for users. Now, legally speaking, private companies have the right to determine what they allow on their platforms that they control, because that's their free speech. And as we know,
corporations are people, my friend.
That being said, some people argue that what big tech is doing is actually more dangerous than government censorship. Why? Well, here's Tucker Carlson asking Republican Senator Josh Hawley a leading question about this very topic.
Is it healthy to live in a society where a tiny group of completely out of touch crazy people have power over what the rest of us can say?
Well, you know, if you want to know what it's like to live in an aristocracy, I mean, just open your eyes. This is it. I mean, we're one tiny group of, in Jack Dorsey's case, really weird people control what we're allowed to say, what we're allowed to share, who's allowed to report on what. I mean, it's just absolutely ludicrous. It really is modern day aristocracy, and it's going to continue until Congress stops it.
First of all, on behalf of weird people everywhere, please don't associate us with Jack Dorsey. But Senator Hawley does make a good point about how a tiny group of people has an outsized amount of control over the rest of us. After all, if you don't like what politicians do, you can vote them out of office. It's a little bit harder for the average American to do anything about a multi-billion-dollar tech company like Google. And it goes beyond free speech. Here's a chilling example. In addition to the election, YouTube has been heavily policing content about the coronavirus pandemic. Here's biologist Brett Weinstein talking about why Google deleted a certain expert's video on the coronavirus from YouTube and why they made it impossible for anyone to even discuss that video on YouTube.
The reason that something like Google might decide that we can't have a discussion about the validity or lack of validity of this expert's point about current COVID and its apparent resurgence, that has again to do with the difference in analysis between the individual and the collective. In effect, what Google is doing is they are deciding that a discussion of this will cause individuals to make decisions that are not in our collective interest. And so Google has decided for us that the way to address that problem is to inflict a conclusion as if it is absolutely secure so that the actual analysis does not occur in public, so that nobody will draw what they consider to be the foregone wrong conclusion, right? So all of that is Google deciding what the answer to the question is and therefore what people are to do in light of it.
So basically, the idea is that Google decides that it knows what's best for us as a collective, so then Google makes decisions for us individuals. So we don't have any of, what's the word? Wrongthink. This is especially bad when it comes to scientific topics because, as we've seen during this pandemic, the science changes. Imagine if back in March, YouTube had decided to censor any videos that claimed the coronavirus was airborne, or that we should wear masks. Remember, back then, experts said we shouldn't wear masks. Masks don't stop coronavirus spread. Why are people ignoring the experts who are telling us not to wear masks? Listen to the science, people. But even if the information is wrong, by not allowing people to discuss it, YouTube doesn't let viewers come to their own conclusion that it's wrong. Instead, they're telling people what to think. The other problem with what big tech companies are doing is that they're making these decisions in a black box and then enforcing them through algorithms. As Katy Perry would say, we're all chained to the algorithm. Algorithms aren't good at handling things that aren't black and white, like discussions or nuance. They especially suck at dealing with satire. This year, YouTube removed several of our videos from China Uncensored, like one about the WHO's response to the coronavirus, and one about Trump questioning a reporter from Chinese state-controlled Phoenix TV. They restored those videos after we appealed and made a big fuss on social media. But one of the most puzzling ones was the first one they removed, called China's Coronavirus Cure. It was actually our News Roundup episode for that week. We couldn't figure out why YouTube had taken it down because they never explained it. And after they put it back up, they still didn't explain it. Then, 9 months later, YouTube suspended the American news channel OANN because of an unlisted video that YouTube claimed talked about a COVID cure, which apparently violated their COVID-19 misinformation policy. And that's when we realized that YouTube probably took down our video back in February because the title was China's Coronavirus Cure. In our case, we were being satirical. The cure that we were talking about was Chinese police slapping people and beating them up for being outside and not wearing a mask. But of course, The YouTube algorithm didn't think our satire was very funny. Even after YouTube put our video back up, it added a warning screen that says the content might be inappropriate or offensive, so you have to click the button to actually see the video. What's inappropriate or offensive about the video? Maybe showing viral videos of police brutality in an authoritarian state? I mean, you should really only be allowed to show police brutality when it happens in a democracy. But more concerning, the fact that we don't know why YouTube did this incentivizes us to self-censor in our future videos, because we don't know what could trigger it again. But that's just one example of the Kafkaesque absurdity that we deal with on YouTube. And it's probably worse for us because we're independent and not part of a big mainstream media organization. Which brings me to the problem of YouTube connecting people to authoritative information, which I'll get to right after this commercial break. Welcome back. Unless YouTube demonetizes this video, in which case, now you see what I mean. YouTube boasts that, on average, 88% of the videos in the top 10 search results related to elections came from authoritative news sources, and the most viewed channels and videos are from news channels like NBC and CBS. Now, this isn't just happening because people love watching NBC and CBS. YouTube is specifically boosting videos from what they consider authoritative news sources. When it comes to non-controversial news stories, that's probably not a big deal. All it does is funnel viewership and ad revenue into the big media companies. But when it comes to controversial stories, authoritative news sources can sometimes be wrong. And they often overlook or misreport really important stories. Look, if we thought that the mainstream American media was doing a great job, we wouldn't have started America Uncovered in the first place. And we even have a segment called, Wait, is that true? Where we look at widely reported news stories to see if they're actually true. Like whether Trump owes millions to China. Not true. Or whether Black Lives Matter was partnered with a pro-Chinese communist group. Also not true. But one of the biggest examples of authoritative news sources getting a story wrong for years has to do with China. Since I started China Uncensored back in 2012, I've been talking about how the Chinese Communist Party kills prisoners of conscience and then sells their organs, a practice called forced organ harvesting. Falun Gong practitioners had been talking about this since 2006. I first mentioned it in this video from November 2012 when, oh my gosh, who is that guy? And who picked out his tie? I know it sounds hard to believe, but the evidence is there. We just did a video last month on China Uncensored about 6 things that show forced organ harvesting is real. Over the years, I've interviewed activists and researchers who had piles of evidence that this was going on, including witness statements. But with very few exceptions, the mainstream media has not talked about the story. Why not? Well, it was controversial. Talking about it could get them kicked out of China, the evidence was complicated, and there was no smoking gun. So they didn't really want to look into it, and they were prejudiced against the very people who were talking about organ harvesting. Instead, authoritative news sources looked the other way, or even reported what Chinese Communist Party propaganda said instead. This BBC article is a lie. China never stopped. It wasn't until 2019, 7 years after I first reported on organ harvesting, the mainstream media started reporting on it widely. And that was only because an independent tribunal looked at the evidence and said it was real. In other words, the authoritative news sources were just reporting what the tribunal said. They didn't have to be responsible for investigating the topic themselves. So for 7 years, we reported on forced organ harvesting while the mainstream media ignored it or said it wasn't true. Imagine if YouTube had stopped us from talking about this and instead steered people to these authoritative news sources on this subject. They would have been terribly wrong, but authoritative. Maybe that's an unfair example since it's about China. But the authoritative news sources have gotten plenty wrong about America, too. Hey, remember WMDs? That article was from 2001. And there are many, many more recent examples too. Like how the media missed Trump winning in 2016, or Trump being cleared of Russia collusion, or how the media botched the Covington Catholic story. But no matter how much credibility the media loses with average Americans, they still have credibility with big tech companies, which, let's be honest, is more important when it comes to getting your content out there. The most recent story that the media and big tech worked together to control was the Hunter Biden scandal. First, Twitter and Facebook censored the New York Post's laptop story, which kind of backfired. Then the media called the story a vast far-right smear campaign of Russian disinformation. And the media buried the story ahead of the election. Successfully. Well, the authoritative news sources have spoken. Authoritatively. Nothing to see here, folks. Except, it turns out, there's actually a federal criminal investigation into Hunter Biden's business dealings with China, which CNN reported earlier this week. This is not new. The investigation began as early as 2018. And the conservative Sinclair Broadcast Group reported that this investigation was going on back in October. But for some reason, CNN wasn't interested in the story back then. I wonder why. I probably wouldn't understand since I'm not an authoritative news source. I guess if I ever want to make it big on social media, I'll have to rely on my new Facebook page, Watching Paint Dry with Chris Chappell. Check it out. I've got some great new content. Let me know what you think about YouTube's new policy. Do you trust authoritative news sources? And as you can see, we don't get much support from YouTube, so be sure to subscribe to this channel and like and share our videos. It's a big help. And as always, a big shout out to everyone who makes this show possible by supporting our work on the crowdfunding website Patreon. Visit patreon.com/AmericaUncovered to learn more. Your direct support is more important now than ever, and you know why. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.